Barents Sea, Arctic Ocean, March 15, 1986. Commander James Hartley of the United States Navy stood in the control room of the USS Scorpion II, a nuclear-powered attack submarine that had been operating beneath the Arctic ice pack for the past 17 days, conducting surveillance operations against Soviet naval facilities along the Kola Peninsula. What Hartley did not realize as he monitored the sonar displays showing the underside of the ice ceiling above them and the ocean floor several hundred meters below was that his submarine was being tracked by a Soviet Victor III class attack submarine that had detected Scorpion II's acoustic signature despite the American boat's sophisticated noise reduction technology, and that was maneuvering into position to shadow the American vessel through the dark waters beneath the polar ice. The operation to monitor Scorpion II represented one of the Soviet Navy's most technically challenging submarine tracking missions during the Cold War era, an operation that succeeded not through superior technology, which the Americans generally possessed in greater measure, but through patient operational planning, through exploitation of acoustic conditions in Arctic waters that created opportunities for detection that would not have existed in other oceanic environments, and through the skill of Soviet submarine commanders who had spent years operating in these waters and who understood how to use the unique characteristics of the Arctic environment to their tactical advantage.
The mission's most remarkable aspect was not the initial detection and tracking of the American submarine, but what occurred on March 23rd when Scorpion II disappeared from all monitoring systems, both Soviet and American, vanishing beneath the Arctic ice in circumstances that would remain unclear for more than 3 decades, and that would generate speculation about whether the submarine had been lost in an accident, had been attacked by Soviet forces, or had suffered some other catastrophe that left no survivors and no wreckage that could be located, despite extensive search operations conducted by both superpowers in the years that followed. Commander James Hartley had been born in San Diego, California in 1945 and had entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1963, graduating in 1967 with a degree in naval architecture and marine engineering, qualifications that had led to his selection for submarine service, a career path that was considered among the most demanding and prestigious in the Navy. Hartley had undergone training at the submarine school in Groton, Connecticut, where he had learned the technical and operational skills necessary for serving aboard nuclear submarines, including reactor operations, damage control procedures, tactical maneuvering, weapon systems operation, and the various other competencies required for officers who would be responsible for operating vessels that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in investment and that carried weapons capable of destroying entire cities if the submarines were ballistic missile boats rather than attack submarines like Scorpion II.
Hartley had served aboard multiple submarines during his career. His early tours were on diesel-electric boats in the late 1960s. He later transitioned to nuclear-powered vessels in the early 1970s as the Navy shifted away from conventional submarines. This move placed him within the nuclear fleet that would dominate American submarine operations for the rest of the Cold War and beyond. Hartley received command of USS Scorpion II in 1984 after serving as executive officer on another attack submarine. He had already demonstrated the leadership, technical skill, and operational judgment required of commanders who operated independently for long periods without direct communication with shore authorities. These commanders had to make tactical decisions in situations where mistakes could mean the loss of the vessel, the loss of the crew, or international incidents that could escalate into wider conflict between the superpowers. USS Scorpion II was a Los Angeles-class attack submarine commissioned in 1982. It was part of the Navy's effort to build fast, quiet attack submarines, able to hunt Soviet ballistic missile submarines, conduct surveillance against Soviet naval facilities, and protect American carrier groups and strategic missile submarines from Soviet threats. The Los Angeles class represented the most advanced American attack submarine technology in the mid-1980s. It carried sophisticated sonar systems capable of detecting enemy submarines at long ranges, advanced propulsion systems that delivered high underwater speeds while keeping acoustic signatures low, and weapon systems including torpedoes and Tomahawk cruise missiles that provided strong offensive capability against both submarine and surface targets.
Scorpion II had been assigned to conduct surveillance operations in the Barents Sea and Arctic Ocean during the winter of 1986 as part of ongoing intelligence collection efforts targeting Soviet naval activities in the region. The Barents Sea was one of the most strategically important bodies of water during the Cold War because it provided the Soviet Northern Fleet with access to the Atlantic Ocean and because the region hosted major Soviet naval bases, including Severomorsk and Polarny, where ballistic missile submarines and attack submarines were based and where they could be observed by American surveillance assets attempting to understand Soviet operational patterns, technological capabilities, and strategic intentions. The Arctic Ocean and the waters beneath the polar ice pack were particularly valuable for submarine operations because the ice cover provided concealment from satellite surveillance and from maritime patrol aircraft that might otherwise detect submarines operating near the surface. The acoustic properties of Arctic waters also created challenges for sonar systems because the combination of varying water temperatures, salinity gradients, and ice coverage created complex sound propagation conditions that could both hinder and enhance detection, depending on the specific circumstances and positions of submarines relative to these acoustic layers and boundaries. American submarines operating in Arctic waters during the Cold War conducted multiple types of missions, including intelligence collection against Soviet naval facilities and communications, tracking of Soviet ballistic missile submarines to establish patterns that would allow American attack submarines to locate and potentially destroy Soviet missile boats if war occurred, mapping of the ocean floor and ice conditions to support potential future operations, including transit routes that ballistic missile submarines might use, and testing of American submarine systems under Arctic conditions to ensure that equipment would function properly in the extreme cold and under the ice if combat operations became necessary in these regions.
The mission that brought Scorpion 2 into the Barents Sea in March 1986 involved approaching the Soviet naval facilities along the Kola Peninsula to collect signals intelligence from Soviet communication systems, to observe Soviet submarine movements as boats departed from or returned to their bases, and to gather acoustic data on Soviet submarine signatures that would help American sonar operators distinguish between different classes of Soviet submarines and potentially identify individual boats based on unique acoustic characteristics created by machinery arrangement, propeller design, or hull configuration. The operational plan called for Scorpion 2 to approach to within approximately 50 nautical miles of the Soviet coast, close enough that the submarine sensors could intercept Soviet communications and detect submarines entering or leaving port, but far enough offshore that the risk of detection by Soviet coastal defense systems, including sonar networks, maritime patrol aircraft, and surface vessels, would be manageable. The plan also called for the submarine to operate primarily beneath the ice pack, where detection would be more difficult because Soviet surveillance systems would have greater difficulty locating a submarine concealed under ice than they would detecting a boat operating in open water, where thermal signatures, periscope detection, or acoustic signatures might reveal the submarine's presence. Scorpion 2 had departed from Holy Loch, Scotland on February 22, 1986, transiting north through the Norwegian Sea and entering the Barents Sea on February 28th after passing through the gap between Norway and Bear Island, a route that American submarines routinely used when conducting operations in the region. The submarine had proceeded under the ice pack beginning on March 1st, navigating using inertial navigation systems that tracked the boat's position based on acceleration measurements, systems that were essential for underwater navigation because GPS signals could not penetrate seawater and because traditional navigation methods using celestial observations or radio beacons were impossible when submerged beneath hundreds of meters of water and meters of ice. The submarine had approached the Soviet coast carefully over the following 2 weeks, moving slowly to minimize acoustic signatures and pausing frequently to conduct sonar sweeps that would detect any Soviet submarines that might be operating in the area and that might pose threats to Scorpion 2 if they detected the American boat. The crew had maintained strict noise discipline during these operations, restricting activities that might create sounds that could be detected by Soviet sonar systems, and ensuring that all machinery was operating properly to prevent mechanical problems that might create unusual noises that would reveal the submarine's presence. What Commander Hartley and his crew did not know was that Soviet naval intelligence had received information suggesting that an American submarine would be operating in the Barents Sea during March 1986, information that had come from a penetration of American naval communications that had revealed general operational plans without providing specific details about which submarine would be deployed or exactly where it would operate. The information had been sufficient to alert Soviet naval commanders that heightened vigilance was necessary and that additional anti-submarine warfare assets should be deployed to increase the probability of detecting the American submarine if it entered Soviet-monitored waters. Soviet Northern Fleet headquarters had ordered multiple Victor III-class attack submarines to conduct barrier patrols in areas where American submarines were most likely to operate,
positioning the Soviet boats in locations where they could potentially detect American submarines transiting toward the coast or operating in intelligence collection positions. The Victor III class was the most capable attack submarine that the Soviet Navy possessed in the mid-1980s, incorporating improved noise reduction compared to earlier Soviet submarines and carrying sophisticated sonar systems that were effective for detecting and tracking enemy submarines, even though Soviet sonar technology generally lagged behind American capabilities. One of the Soviet submarines assigned to these barrier patrols was K-324, commanded by Captain First Rank Anatoly Petrov, an experienced submarine officer who had served in the Northern Fleet for more than 15 years and who had conducted multiple patrols beneath the Arctic ice during his career.
Petrov had positioned K-324 along a route that intelligence analysis suggested American submarines might use when approaching the Kola Peninsula, a position approximately 70 nautical miles from the coast in waters where the ice pack was solid but where leads and polynyas occasionally opened in the ice, creating areas of open water that submarines might use for emergency surfacing if necessary. K-324 had been operating in this area for 10 days when its sonar operators detected a faint contact on March 14th, a sound that analysis suggested was consistent with a submarine rather than with natural sounds created by ice movement, marine life, or oceanographic conditions. The contact was extremely faint, at the edge of detection range, but the sonar operators believed they were detecting machinery noises from a submarine that was attempting to operate quietly, but that was producing sounds that propagated through the water in ways that allowed detection despite the submarine's noise reduction measures. Captain Petrov ordered his submarine to maneuver toward the contact, moving slowly to avoid creating noises that might alert the target submarine that it was being tracked. The approach took several hours because K-324 had to maintain sufficient distance that its own acoustic signature would not be detected while simultaneously keeping the target contact within sonar range, a delicate balance that required constant adjustments to speed, course, and depth to maintain optimal acoustic conditions. By the evening of March 14th, K-324's sonar operators had refined their analysis and had determined that the contact was almost certainly an American Los Angeles-class submarine based on the acoustic signature characteristics, including the frequency spectrum of machinery noises, the blade rate of their propeller, and other subtle indicators that experienced sonar operators could use to classify submarine types, even when direct visual identification was impossible because both submarines were operating hundreds of meters below the surface and beneath the ice.
Petrov reported the detection to Northern Fleet headquarters, transmitting a brief encrypted message using a communications buoy that was released to float up to the surface through a hole that K-324's crew created in the ice by using the submarine's sail to break through a thin section of ice cover. The communications buoy transmitted the message to Soviet communication satellites and then sank to prevent recovery by American or Norwegian intelligence services that might be monitoring the area. The message informed headquarters that K-324 had detected and was tracking an American submarine and requested instructions regarding how aggressively to shadow the target and whether to attempt to force the American submarine to leave the area through active harassment measures. Northern Fleet headquarters responded within 6 hours, ordering Petrov to continue tracking the American submarine and to gather as much intelligence as possible about its operational patterns, its acoustic signature, and its apparent mission objectives. The orders specifically instructed Petrov not to take any actions that might alert the American submarine that it was being tracked, because allowing the Americans to continue their operations while under Soviet surveillance would provide more valuable intelligence than forcing the submarine to withdraw would generate. K-324 continued tracking Scorpion 2 for the next 8 days, maintaining a trailing position approximately 10 to 15 kilometers behind the American submarine and adjusting depth to ensure optimal acoustic conditions for maintaining sonar contact while remaining outside the range at which Scorpion 2 sonar would likely detect K-324's presence. The tracking operation required extraordinary patience and skill, because any mistake in maneuvering or any equipment malfunction that created unusual noises might alert the Americans that they were being followed, potentially causing them to abort their mission or to attempt to evasive maneuvers that might break contact.
During this tracking period, Soviet sonar operators collected extensive acoustic data on Scorpion 2, recording the sounds created by the submarine's propulsion system, by auxiliary machinery, by water flow over the hull, and by other sources that contributed to the submarine's acoustic signature. The data would be analyzed by Soviet naval intelligence to refine their understanding of Los Angeles-class acoustic characteristics and to improve Soviet sonar systems' ability to detect and classify American submarines in future encounters.
Commander Hartley and the crew of Scorpion II conducted their surveillance operations throughout this period without apparent awareness that they were being tracked by a Soviet submarine. The American boat moved along the coast, conducting signals intelligence collection, recording Soviet communications, and monitoring for Soviet submarine movements. The crew maintained their standard operating procedures, conducting periodic sonar sweeps to check for nearby contacts, but not detecting K-324 because the Soviet submarine was positioned in an acoustic shadow zone, where sound propagation conditions made detection difficult, and because Soviet noise reduction measures kept K-324's acoustic signature below the threshold that Scorpion II's sonar could reliably detect at the ranges involved. On March 22nd, Scorpion II began moving away from the coast, apparently preparing to transit out of the Barents Sea and return to base after completing its surveillance mission. K-324 continued following, maintaining contact as both submarines moved through the ice-covered waters. Petrov reported the American submarine's departure to Northern Fleet headquarters, which acknowledged the report and instructed K-324 to continue tracking for as long as possible to establish the American submarine's exit route from the area. On March 23rd, at approximately 0340 hours local time, sonar operators aboard K-324 detected unusual sounds from the direction of Scorpion II, sounds that suggested some kind of mechanical problem or internal emergency aboard the American submarine. The sounds included what appeared to be high-pressure air release, suggesting that the American submarine might be performing emergency ballast blowing to surface or to adjust depth rapidly, and metallic sounds that might indicate equipment failure or structural stress. Captain Petrov ordered K-324 to maneuver closer to investigate what was occurring, concerned that the American submarine might be experiencing a serious casualty that could result in loss of the vessel. Soviet doctrine called for rendering assistance to submarines in distress, even if they belonged to potential adversaries, because submarine crews faced common dangers from the hostile ocean environment, and because the tradition of mutual assistance among mariners extended even into the realm of military operations, where adversaries might fight each other in war but would assist each other when facing the sea itself.
As K-324 closed the distance towards Scorpion 2's last known position, sonar operators reported that contact with the American submarine had been lost. The sounds that had been tracking for more than a week had ceased, and despite intensive sonar searching, no contact could be reestablished. The sonar operators reported detecting sounds consistent with water rushing into spaces, sounds that might indicate hull rupture or flooding, and then silence. Petrov ordered K-324 to surface through the ice to establish communications with Northern Fleet headquarters and to report that the American submarine appeared to have suffered a catastrophic casualty and might have been lost. The Soviet submarine broke through the ice at approximately 0420 hours and transmitted an emergency message describing what had been observed and requesting instructions regarding whether K-324 should remain in the area to search for survivors or debris or should continue with other assigned missions. Northern Fleet headquarters responded within the hour, ordering K-324 to remain in the area and to conduct a thorough search for any evidence of what had happened to the American submarine. Additional Soviet vessels, including icebreakers and salvage ships, were ordered to proceed to the area to assist with search operations if debris or the wreck could be located. Soviet maritime patrol aircraft were also dispatched to search the area from above, looking for any openings in the ice where the American submarine might have surfaced or where debris might have emerged. The search operations continued for 5 days, with multiple Soviet vessels and aircraft combing the area where Scorpion 2 had last been detected. No debris, no oil flicks, no wreckage, and no survivors were found, despite extensive efforts covering hundreds of square kilometers of ocean beneath the ice. The ice conditions made searching extremely difficult because the solid pack ice prevented visual observation of the water surface and because debris or wreckage might be trapped beneath the ice where it could not be detected from above.
Soviet officials debated whether to inform the United States that an American submarine had apparently been lost in Soviet-monitored waters, a notification that would reveal that Soviet forces had been tracking the American submarine, but that might also be seen as a humanitarian gesture and that might prevent American search operations from being delayed while the U.S. Navy tried to determine what had happened to their missing vessel. The decision was made to provide notification through diplomatic channels on March 28th, 5 days after the disappearance.
Soviet authorities informed the American embassy in Moscow that a Soviet submarine had detected what appeared to be sounds consistent with a submarine casualty in the Barents Sea on March 23rd, and that Soviet forces had conducted search operations but had found no evidence of survivors or wreckage. The Soviets provided approximate coordinates for where the incident had occurred and offered to share any information that might assist American search efforts. The notification created immediate crisis response in Washington, where senior Navy officials had already been growing concerned that Scorpion 2 had not reported as scheduled on March 25th. Submarines operating under the ice maintained strict communication schedules because the inability to communicate in real time meant that miscommunications might be the first indication that something had gone wrong. When Scorpion 2 had failed to make its scheduled communication, Navy officials had initially assumed that ice conditions or equipment problems might have delayed the contact, but as additional hours passed without communication, concern had grown that the submarine had suffered some kind of casualty. The Soviet notification confirmed the worst fears of American naval officials and triggered the activation of the Submiss Response Protocol, the submarine missing procedures that the Navy maintained for responding to potential losses of submarines. The protocol called for immediate notification of senior leadership, including the president, for activation of search and rescue assets, and for coordination with allied nations that might be able to contribute to search efforts or that might have information about what had occurred. The U.S. Navy deployed multiple assets to the Barents Sea to search for Scorpion 2, including attack submarines that would search beneath the ice, surface vessels, including salvage ships that would be positioned to assist if the wreck could be located, and maritime patrol aircraft that would search from above using radar and visual observation. The British Royal Navy also contributed assets, including submarines and maritime patrol aircraft, because the incident had occurred in waters where British forces also operated, and because the alliance relationship between the United States and United Kingdom created expectations of mutual assistance in such circumstances. The search operations continued for 3 weeks, with American and British forces systematically searching the area where Soviet forces had reported detecting the casualty sounds. Sophisticated sonar systems were used to scan the ocean floor looking for wreckage, and under-ice search procedures were conducted by submarines that carefully navigated through the ice-covered waters looking for any evidence of what had happened to Scorpion 2.
No wreckage was found despite extensive searching. No debris field, no scattered equipment, no hull sections that might indicate where the submarine had gone down and what had caused its loss. The lack of evidence created profound confusion among search coordinators because submarines that suffer catastrophic casualties typically leave some trace that can be located through systematic searching, even if the wreck itself is not immediately found. American naval intelligence analysts began investigating alternative theories about what might have happened to Scorpion 2 beyond the initial assumption that the submarine had suffered an accidental casualty. Some analysts suggested that the submarine might have been attacked by Soviet forces and that the Soviets were concealing their involvement by claiming they had only detected casualty sounds, rather than admitting that they had engaged the American submarine. Other analysts suggested that the submarine might have suffered a collision with underwater ice formations or with the ocean floor in circumstances that caused the boat to be buried under sediment or ice where it could not be detected by sonar. Still, other analysts suggested the possibility that the submarine had not actually been lost, but had instead been captured by Soviet forces through some kind of operation that forced the submarine to surface and that allowed Soviet personnel to seize the boat and its crew. Soviet officials categorically denied that they had attacked Scorpion 2 or had been involved in the submarine's disappearance beyond detecting what appeared to be casualty sounds and conducting search operations. Soviet authorities provided detailed information about K-324's tracking of the American submarine and about the sounds that had been detected on March 23rd. Information that was intended to demonstrate Soviet transparency and to refute suggestions that Soviet forces had attacked the American boat. The lack of evidence and the inability to locate Scorpion 2 created significant political tensions between the superpowers, with American officials suspicious that the Soviets were not being truthful about their involvement, and with Soviet officials frustrated that their offers of assistance and their sharing of information were being met with skepticism rather than appreciation. The incident occurred during a period when U.S.-Soviet relations were already strained because of ongoing conflicts in Afghanistan, disagreements over arms control negotiations, and mutual suspicions about each side's military activities and strategic intentions.
The families of the 129 officers and enlisted personnel who had been aboard Scorpion 2 were notified that the submarine was missing and presumed lost with all hands, notifications that were devastating for spouses, parents, and children who had believed their loved ones were conducting routine training operations rather than high-risk intelligence collection missions in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The Navy held memorial services for the crew while continuing to describe them as missing rather than confirmed dead because no wreckage had been found and because there remained some small possibility that the submarine had survived and that the crew might still be alive somewhere beneath the ice. The investigation into what had caused Scorpion 2 to disappear continued for months, with teams of analysts reviewing every piece of available evidence, including the acoustic data that Soviet forces had provided, the operational plans that had guided Scorpion 2's mission, the maintenance records for the submarine that might indicate whether equipment problems had existed before the deployment, and the environmental conditions in the Barents Sea on March 23rd that might have contributed to a casualty. Several theories emerged from the investigation as potentially explaining what had happened. One theory suggested that Scorpion 2 had suffered a catastrophic flooding casualty caused by a pipe rupture or a hull penetration that had allowed water to enter the submarine faster than the crew could control it, leading to loss of buoyancy and sinking to depths where the hull collapsed under pressure. This theory was consistent with the sounds that Soviet sonar operators had reported hearing, including high-pressure air release and water rushing sounds. Another theory suggested that the submarine had become trapped under the ice in circumstances where it could not find a polynya or thin ice area where it could surface for emergency procedures, and that the crew had eventually exhausted their air supply or had suffered carbon dioxide poisoning when atmospheric control systems failed. This theory would explain why no wreckage had been found, because the submarine might still be intact beneath the ice, rather than having broken apart and scattered debris across the ocean floor.
A third theory suggested that Scorpion 2 had suffered a reactor accident that had disabled the submarine's propulsion and power systems, leaving the boat unable to maneuver and unable to operate critical systems, including life support. The submarine might have drifted under the ice until it struck an underwater obstacle, or until systems failures caused progressive flooding that eventually sank the boat. The most controversial theory suggested that Scorpion 2 had been attacked by Soviet forces, despite Soviet denials, possibly through use of a weapon system that left no obvious evidence, such as a mine or a torpedo, that had been designed to disable rather than destroy the submarine. This theory was supported by analysts who believed that the timing of the incident, shortly after Scorpion 2 had completed its surveillance mission, suggested Soviet forces might have waited until the intelligence collection was complete before attacking to maximize the propaganda value of stopping American espionage operations. None of these theories could be proven or disproven without finding the wreck and conducting forensic analysis of the hull and internal systems to determine what had actually caused the submarine's loss. The Navy continued periodic searches of the Barents Sea for years after the incident, using increasingly sophisticated sonar systems and underwater vehicles to scan areas where the submarine might have gone down. Soviet authorities periodically provided additional information that they claimed might help locate the wreck, including more detailed acoustic data from K-324s, tracking and information about ocean currents that might have caused wreckage to drift from the initial casualty location. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian naval officials provided American counterparts with access to additional information about the incident, including a full operational logs from K-324, an analysis that Soviet naval intelligence had conducted in the years after Scorpion 2's disappearance. The Russian officials asserted that Soviet forces had not attacked the American submarine, and that the most likely explanation was an accidental casualty caused by equipment failure or by collision with underwater ice formations that had trapped or damaged the submarine in ways that prevented recovery. American analysts who reviewed the Russian information concluded that it appeared genuine and that it supported the conclusion that Scorpion 2 had been lost in an accident rather than having been attacked.
However, the analysts also noted that certain details in the Russian materials seemed inconsistent with what would be expected if the casualty had been purely accidental, including indications that K-324 had been maneuvering toward Scorpion 2 at high speed in the minutes before the casualty sounds were detected, movements that might suggest the Soviet submarine had been positioning for attack, rather than merely observing. The debate about what happened to Scorpion 2 continued within the naval intelligence community and among historians and researchers who studied Cold War submarine operations. Some argued that the evidence supported accidental loss, while others maintained that Soviet involvement was likely, even if it could not be definitively proven. The lack of physical evidence in the form of the wreck meant that all conclusions remained speculative, and that the truth about what had occurred beneath the Arctic ice on March 23, 1986, might never be known with certainty. In 2019, a remote-operated underwater vehicle conducting oceanographic research in the Barents Sea detected what appeared to be a large metallic object on the ocean floor in an area approximately 150 kilometers from where Scorpion 2 had last been detected by Soviet forces. The discovery prompted renewed interest in potentially locating and examining the object to determine if it might be the missing submarine. However, the Russian government denied permission for American or international teams to conduct detailed investigation of the object, citing concerns about disturbing what might be a war grave and about potential impacts on sensitive military activities in the region. Satellite imagery analysis of the search area showed that Russian naval vessels had visited the location shortly after the object was detected, and had appeared to conduct operations that might have involved deploying equipment to the ocean floor. American intelligence officials speculated that Russian forces might have been attempting to recover or examine the wreck themselves, or might have been placing monitoring equipment to detect if foreign salvage operations were attempted. The families of Scorpion 2's crew continued advocating for efforts to locate and recover the submarine, or at minimum to conduct sufficient investigation to determine definitively what had caused the loss. Family advocacy groups argued that the crew deserved to have their remains recovered and properly interred rather than leaving them entombed in the submarine at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. The families also argued that understanding what had caused the casualty was essential for preventing similar losses in the future and for ensuring that the Navy learned whatever lessons the incident might provide about submarine safety and operational procedures.
The Navy maintained that recovery operations would be extremely difficult, given the depth, ice conditions, and political sensitivities of conducting salvage work in Russian-claimed waters. Navy officials also noted that even if the wreck could be located, the condition of the hull after more than 3 decades on the ocean floor might make forensic analysis difficult and might not provide clear answers about what had caused the initial casualty. The cost of conducting deepwater recovery operations in Arctic conditions would be substantial and might not be justifiable given the uncertain prospects for actually determining what had happened. The disappearance of USS Scorpion 2 remained one of the most significant unsolved mysteries of Cold War submarine operations, joining other submarine losses including the original USS Scorpion in 1968, the French submarine Minerve in 1968, the Israeli submarine Dakar in 1968, and the Soviet submarine K-129 in 1968, in a series of incidents that demonstrated the inherent dangers of submarine operations and the challenges of determining what had occurred when submarines were lost in deep water far from observation. The incident raised ongoing questions about the risks that submarine crews faced when conducting intelligence operations in contested waters, about whether the intelligence value obtained from such operations justified the risk to personnel and to expensive vessels, and about whether submarine operating procedures adequately protected crews from the various hazards they faced, including equipment failures, environmental dangers, and potential hostile actions by adversary forces. The incident also raised questions about transparency and information sharing between former adversaries in the post-Cold War era. The Russian government's willingness to share information about the incident in the 1990s had suggested a new era of cooperation, but the subsequent refusal to permit investigation of the potentially discovered wreck indicated that sensitivities remained about Cold War operations and about what might be revealed if the wreck was thoroughly examined by American or international investigators.
For the submariners who kept operating in Arctic waters after Scorpion 2 disappeared, the incident was a stark warning. It reminded them of the dangers they faced every day. Even with advanced technology, the Arctic Ocean was still one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. A single mistake or equipment failure could lead to catastrophe. If something went wrong, rescue was impossible. The event reinforced several lessons. Training mattered, maintenance mattered, discipline mattered. Most of all, respect for the hostile environment mattered. The families of Scorpion 2's crew built a memorial at the Submarine Memorial in Groton, Connecticut. It honored the 129 officers and enlisted sailors who were lost. They wanted to make sure the crew's service and sacrifice would never be forgotten. Their loved ones had no known resting place, and the circumstances of the loss were still unclear. The memorial listed the names of all the crew. It also carried an inscription noting that they were lost while serving their country in dangerous waters far from home. The disappearance of USS Scorpion II beneath the Arctic ice showed the courage of submarine crews. These were people who operated in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. It also showed how tragic things could become when something went wrong in a place where no help could reach them. The Cold War pushed both superpowers into risky missions, as each tried to gain intelligence advantages. Many of those missions placed crews in extreme danger. Sometimes, the objectives did not justify the risks. What exactly happened to Scorpion II on March 23, 1986, remains a mystery. It joined the long list of submarines lost with no clear explanation. The ocean kept its secrets. Only questions, grief, and the memories of sailors who went to sea and never returned were left behind.